Welcome to day 2 of the third Harvard Korean Security Summit. My name is John Park, Director of the Career Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. During day 1, our stellar panel speakers examined ways to enhance security on the Korean Peninsula. Our thanks again to ROK Foreign Minister Dr. Park Jin, KF President Dr. Gun Lee, and Natalie Colbert for their excellent speeches. For day 2, we'll be focusing on building mutual prosperity through resilient technology supply chains. For our day 2 keynote remarks, it's my pleasure to introduce Tammy Overby. Tammy is president of Asia Pathfinders, a boutique consulting firm specializing in US-Asia economic affairs. Most recently, she spent over 4 years as senior director with McClarty Associates, where she advised clients on Asia and trade matters with a particular focus on Korea. Tammy has over 3 decades of experience leading Asia work, including 21 years living and working in Seoul. She previously served as president of the US-Korea Business Council. Tammy has an extensive track record helping American companies compete and prosper in Asia. Thanks so much for joining today, Tammy. Over to you.
And thank you to the Harvard Kennedy Center for inviting me to offer some framing comments. The US-Korea economic relationship has evolved significantly over the last few years. When I first moved to Seoul in 1988, American companies complained that Korea was one of the hardest places in Asia to do business. When I left Korea 21 years later to move to DC to run the US Chambers Asia program, American companies were then saying Korea was one of the best places in Asia to do business. One of the principal reasons for this change was the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or the KORUS FTA. It's interesting to note that the US only has 3 free trade agreements in Asia. We have one with Singapore, Australia, and in 2012, the KORUS FTA entered into force. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of that agreement. And in spite of what a former president said, the numbers and the American companies doing business with Korea make it very clear that this is a very successful trade agreement. According to US Trade Representative Tai, over the last decade, the value of goods and services the US has exported to Korea has grown over 17% to nearly $70 billion. Last year, US agriculture exports reached $9.4 billion, a record amount that has increased nearly 35% during the decade of the KORUS Free Trade Agreement. In addition, last year, Korea became the #1 importer of US beef, both by volume and value. In addition to the normal role of a free trade agreement to resolve trade irritants, our governments last year agreed to expand the KORUS FTA to include future-oriented issues such as supply chain challenges, emerging technologies, digital ecosystem, and trade facilitation, with the intention of deepening cooperation to enable common approaches and responses to challenges facing global trade. In 2010, when the US was leading TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a comprehensive high standard trade agreement, Korea was invited to join. But at that time, the Koreans were suffering from FTA fatigue after just having completed both the EU-Korea FTA and the KORUS FTA. By 2013, Korean officials had changed their minds and were seeking to join the agreement. But the US felt the negotiations had moved too far to add a new negotiating partner, especially after just adding Japan. In addition, I think the Koreans at that time didn't believe Japan was serious about trade negotiations and expected them to slow down the agreement and lower the ambition, making it unlikely, in many people's view, that the agreement would actually come to fruition. They, along with many in Washington, misjudged Japan's participation. They missed the cues that Japan under Prime Minister Abe was changing. It turned out that Japan's participation was very helpful to the United States, as we were no longer the sole demandeur. With Japan at the table, they often had market access to offer as a sweetener to encourage the other countries to do the difficult things we were asking them to do. Then on day 3 of President Trump's administration, without any review, he withdrew the United States from the TPP agreement in what I believe will go down in history as one of the biggest strategic economic mistakes of my lifetime. Fortunately, Japan and the other 11 signatories completed the deal, now known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It entered into force December 30th, 2018. Korea has expressed interest in joining, although they already have FTAs with most of the CPTPP members. They don't have one with Japan, and this would be significant. Korea is a member of Rcep, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's largest trade agreement and includes 15 Asian countries. 3 key points about Rcep, although it is considered a lower standard agreement than CPTPP. 1, the trade ministers of all 15 countries meet together at least once a year to talk about facilitating more intra-Asian trade. 2, a single rule of origin, meaning if one can export a product to one country, one can export it to all 15 with the same piece of paper. And then lastly, China, Japan, and Korea are all members. And this is expected to create more trade between these 3 Northeast Asian countries. Then on May 23rd, President Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, with 13 other initial countries, including South Korea. Together, these countries represent 40% of global GDP. IPEF includes 4 pillars: fair trade, supply chain resilience, clean energy, and tax and anti-corruption. USTR will lead the trade pillar, while Commerce Department will lead the other 3. South Korea has already agreed to join all 4 pillars and very much hopes this framework will be inclusive and that other countries who are able to meet the agreed upon principles will be able to join at an appropriate time. However, each of the 14 IPEF participants is not expected to sign up to all 4 pillars. The draft joint statement from last week's ministerial in Singapore on the trade pillar was leaked to the press and shows only broad trade commitments. The next ministerial appears to have been set for next week. So to recap, to date, the 14 countries participating have only agreed to a scoping exercise, and it's believed that the final agreement will be a la carte, allowing countries to pick and choose which pillars they want to join. In addition, the full agreement is not expected to have full dispute settlement mechanisms or to be fully legally binding. So it's difficult to see how Commerce Secretary Raimundo's prediction that IPEF will be more robust than a free trade agreement will be accurate. But it is hugely politically significant that the US is re-engaging with Asia. The Quad. The Quad is a security dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the US. While Korea has not been invited and probably wouldn't want to join, President Yoon has indicated he would consider having Korea join some of the working groups under the Quad. Then we shift to the Mineral Security Partnership. South Korea was one of the 11 founding members of the US-led Mineral Security Partnership, or MSP, which was just formed on June 30th, 2022, and made up of countries that are committed to responsible, critical mineral supply chains to support economic prosperity and climate objectives. Members include Australia, Canada, the UK, France, and Germany, along with others, in addition to Japan and South Korea. It's interesting to note that China and Russia, 2 of the world's largest mineral exporters, were not invited to join. And then we have the Chip 4 or Fab 4, a US-led semiconductor chain alliance, supply chain alliance. The US began talking to potential partners about this new initiative last March to discuss ways to strengthen cooperation on semiconductors. As part of economic security, many countries have been reviewing their critical supply chains to ensure resilience in a very challenging world. Japan and Taiwan have already indicated interest in this new collaboration. South Korea has been asked to make a decision by late August, as the working level discussions are expected to begin then. Only today, South Korea's ICT Minister Lee expressed concern and suggested Korea must very carefully review this decision over the very real concern of China's possible economic coercion. I'm sure everyone remembers the economic retaliation over Korea's decision to support THAAD in 2017. The US is a leading player in the most advanced chips, while Japan takes the lead in supplying key materials and equipment. And then Korea and Taiwan are both semiconductor manufacturing giants. Since both Korea's major semiconductor companies, Samsung and SK Hynix, operate fab plants in China and are major suppliers of chips to China, it is thought that these challenges can be mitigated, but they will need to be very carefully managed. And finally, in closing, I want to posit that the framing language of these new initiatives is very important. Let me share with you the comments from two key leaders in Asia regarding these new efforts. Some in the Biden administration initially framed some of these initiatives as democracies versus autocracies. But Singapore Prime Minister Lee cautioned the US and encouraged us instead to frame them as rules-based coalitions versus those who flout the rules, or cheaters, basically. Prime Minister Han Duck-soo said he hoped IPEF would be an inclusive agreement and one that other countries would be able to join when they were able to and willing to meet the principles in due course. I hope this has provided y'all with a framework for what I know is going to be a very lively conversation. Thanks, and back to you, John.
Tammy, thanks so much for setting the stage for our discussion. Really appreciate that. Before turning to panel 2, I ask our speakers to remain muted with their videos on. Dr. Francesco Giovannini, Executive Director of the Managing the Atom Project at the Belfer Center, will be moderating panel 2 and introducing our speaker shortly. Dr. Giovannini previously served as Strategy and Policy Officer to the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Prior to that, she was Director of the Research Program in Global Security and International Affairs at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Dr. Giovannini.
Thank you so much, John. And good evening, good afternoon, or good morning to all of you joining us today. I know there is a lot of interest in this panel, and rightly so. I have to begin by saying that this annual Harvard Korean Security Summit has really become a landmark event for the Belfer Center and is acquiring prominence and centrality in a time where competition among great powers and also the dialogue between the East and the West is getting more and more fragmented. So I really want to congratulate Dr. Park and his team for putting together something that is pretty extraordinary, and it really is helping to forge a real dialogue across the continent. So thank you so much, John, for all your work. John has asked me to moderate this panel, and I have to say I'm a little bit outside of my comfort zone, because in normal times, I would have led discussions about nuclear issues. But technology today is clearly taking over. And I have to say, for laypersons like myself, approaching and looking at the supply chain issues we are having in a post-COVID world, the impression is that there is no global supply chain, and the supply chain that we have is incredibly vulnerable and catastrophically so. And so I'm really honored to have the chance to moderate this panel today and really to listen and learn from great experts who might offer us some very important insights. When we talk about technology supply chain, I believe we are talking about a phenomenon that really cuts across international security concerns and geopolitical and economic concerns. So it is a really important issue that cuts across so many domains and so many sectors. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists, and then we'll get into a conversation. I have 5 or 6 questions that I want to pose to the panelists, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And I really invite you all to bring your best questions to the fore, and we'll try to address them in a very lively debate. So the panel today is composed by really an extraordinary amount of talent and expertise. The panel features the Honorable Dr. Tejo Park. Doesn't need any introduction, but just let me mention that Dr. Park is a former South Korea Minister of Trade and is currently the president of the Lee & Co. Global Commerce Institute. Now, the Belfer Center and the Korea Project this year is also fortunate enough to count Dr. Park as a senior visiting scholar for the year, and we are absolutely delighted to count on your expertise and your talent. Second is Ambassador Mark Lippert. Again, doesn't need any introduction. Ambassador Lippert right now is Executive Vice President, Head of US Public Affairs, and Chief Risk Officer of Samsung Electronics, and he was former US Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. Third panelist is Damien Ma, Managing Director of Macro Polo at the Paulson Institute. And finally, last but not least, Naomi Wilson, who is the Vice President of Policy Asia at the Information Technology Industry Council. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I really want to start, which is a very broad question, which is a rather complex one. What are, in your view, the things that we have underestimated or maybe overestimated about investments by South Korean conglomerates in the United States? Dr. Park, if I can start with you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. This is like 6 o'clock in the morning, so I'm not very clear in thinking. But in any case, you saw many news coming out these days. Korean companies, including Samsung Electronics, LG, SK, or Hyundai Motor companies are investing in the United States. Total amount sometimes we saw the report is rising up to $40 billion. And this number is changing because all the companies are changing their plan. But so, I'm sure I'm a kind of trade economist by training. Koreans, for example, Korean semiconductor companies, Samsung Electronics or Hynix, they invest in the United States. It's good for the US economy, as you know. They can create more jobs in the United States and secure a stable supply of semiconductor, and also maybe outcompete China and so on. It is also good for Korean companies because they can have access to the US market, which is most advanced and largest market in the world. However, there are some kind of concerns, like the price of semiconductor supplied by the Korean firms in the United States could be higher than price before when they export from Korea or other countries to the United States. And also, the US is providing quite a large amount of financial support by tax exemption or some incentives to induce Korean companies to invest in the United States. Maybe that kind of money could be used for US workers in other sectors or industries. There are also some concerns to Korean companies who are investing in the United States. It's not all the concern, but there are some concern. They may face difficulties to find sometimes qualified workers with the proper skills in the United States. I think we had some cases in the past. Also, they may have additional difficulties due to a lack of infrastructure of supplying electricity and even industrial water. They also have to find new markets to sell semiconductor they used to export to the United States, while they are not allowed to export some of the semiconductor to China. So they have to find new market to sell. Furthermore, they may find it difficult to secure stable supply of parts, components, and the key materials they used to import from China. So it all depends on the relationship between Korea and China after all. Finally, these major conglomerates of Korean companies may feel some pressure from the Korean people, and particularly domestic sector, domestic workers. They may argue that they should see more investment in Korea rather than overseas investment. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Excellent point. We'll pick up on some of your comments in following questions. Ambassador Lippert, what is your impression of what we have underestimated or overestimated?
No, thanks, and great honor to be here. And I would just say thanks to the Belfer Center, thanks to Harvard, thanks to Dr. Park. And let me just say at the outset, I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a private citizen, because some of these questions clearly stray into areas well beyond the writ of Samsung, and I don't want to inadvertently suggest a view for a broader area of questions. All right, to answer your question, I'll answer. I'll really take your question literally, underestimate, overestimate. And I think the thing we underestimate about this investment is that it builds on what Tammy, Ms. Overby, outlined in her opening remarks, a strong, steady, multifaceted relationship between the Republic of Korea and the United States that has grown and matured over time. And not to recap the whole arc of the relationship, but principally, it was a security relationship for decades. Then you added the Chorus FTA free trade agreement as a second pillar. Now you're adding Kyungjae-anbo, right? You're adding economic security, in addition to a very strong and growing people-to-people cultural relationship. So I think what is lost here is that there's a narrow focus on the investment piece, which is a very important thing, and that's why we're here. But it's the cumulative impact on the overall relationship, the maturation of the partnership, and the resiliency it's bringing across a number of facets. Let me say that on the underestimate. On the overestimate, I would say it perhaps is a little bit of an underestimate too. So it depends on which way you look at it. There's so much focus on the Korean investments here. We're forgetting about what President Yoon outlined in his address at the Samsung Pyeongtaek site. There's now FDI flowing back into Korea from the United States. And I think we often we overestimate or over-evaluate or overanalyze the Korean flows and aren't looking at the US flows, which I think is quite an interesting phenomenon too. And let me just get off the stage by saying, I think more US companies are interested in Korea. I've felt that for a long time. There's a very viable, highly skilled workforce. The location and the infrastructure is fantastic. So I can't tell you how many small, medium, and even large companies come to me and express an interest, which dovetails with Tammy's comments about the arc of the ease of investment into Korea. Then that's changing as well. So let me just stop there. And again, thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I really appreciate also you bringing in this question of the culture, right, and the soft diplomacy aspect, which I think is extremely important in solidifying relationships. Damien.
Well, thank you, and it's terrific to be on this panel with such distinguished experts. I guess to answer your question more directly in terms of FDI, what we're overestimating and underestimating, since I tend to be the one that comes from more of an economic market commercial perspective. I think we overestimate the extent to which political arguments is sufficiently persuasive for continued flows of FDI. Because at the end of the day, companies are companies. And to kind of piggyback off of Dr. Barks, there are a lot of commercial reasons where whether it's Korean, Japanese, or even Chinese. That can make it a little bit more difficult. Things like the CHIP Act being caught up in Congress, right? That's been a big deal. The $52 billion. So I think we need to think a little bit more about what are the commercial reasons, what are the market reasons that people that foreign investors will want to invest in the United States, including things in the high tech supply chain. And what we're underestimating, and I'm here in Chicago. I think I'm one of the few that's not inside the Beltway. People tend to often forget investments happen in the states, in local government. Subnational is extremely important, especially when you talk about a country like South Korea, where obviously the auto sector, EVs is going to be a big deal, and that's really predominantly the Midwest, and plus a little bit of the Sun Belt. And there's very different political dynamics at the local level, incentives. Some states are pro-union states. Some are not. foreign investors tend to kind of lump the United States together. So there's a lot of, so there are many ways in which you have to distinguish between, where you do your investment, because foreign investment is ultimately about location. And so there's, you can kind of think about the policy, policy environment in DC, but at the end of the day, where you place your plant, it's either going to be in Georgia or it's going to be in Michigan or Ohio. Right. And also to Dr. Park's point, one of the challenges is that we're asking, companies like, Samsung or, Hyundai and others to come in and invest. But we don't have a EV supply chain here. We simply don't. That's a reality. We're building it from scratch. China has one. We don't have one yet. And so there's going to be some challenges here in terms of, how we actually make that happen, and how fast and how quickly FDI can be part of that solution. So that would be my sort of way of explaining overestimating and underestimating.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. I have a follow-up question after I'll raise. Naomi.
Thank you, and it's great to be with you all this morning and evening, respectively. Really looking forward to this discussion. On the overestimate, underestimate question, I'll just add that I think there's an underestimate of how long it takes to really establish a presence in a different geography. Fabs cost billions of dollars to establish. And as Dr. Park alluded to, there is also a need to have infrastructure in terms of skilled employees and labor ready to go. So we're really talking about a long-term plan here. And, Americans don't tend to think in the long term. So I know we're all very focused on the CHIPS Act and getting it funded, which, ITI absolutely wants to see. And it's a really important first step. But I think policymakers and we all need to keep in mind that this is a long game, and it's going to take years to establish these types of facilities. And also that the US is competing with other geographies to offer incentives. We're not the only ones that want to attract Korean companies. And to Damien's point, companies are competing against each other, and they're going to be looking at the best deal that they can get to.
Fantastic. I have a follow-up question to you, all of you. You have pointed out some really interesting concerns. Dr. Park, you said South Korean companies are concerned about the lack of infrastructures, even to find industrial water or electricity. There is a lot of pressure to invest nationally, domestically, which makes perfect sense. Damien, you pointed out, for example, the question of local cultures, right? States that behave differently and understand maybe market and free trade very differently. And Naomi, you suggested also this idea of timing and an infrastructure that is still in development. So I wonder, could you give us a sense of how much you think the South Korean companies that now look at the American market fully understand these major deficits from the outside? Dr. Park, if I can start with you.
Yes, I think these days, like our investor, Mark Lifford, the company has a lot of experts inside their companies who understand the situation about the investment environment in the United States. For example, even though I show this general kind of concerns, but Hyundai Motor Company just decided to establish a kind of research lab about the new mobility, EV vehicles, things like that in Montana. Why Montana? Because they are looking for many other places, but Montana has a good university, which is pretty big, and they are producing annually high quality of workers in Montana. And also they have a lot of facilities to test vehicles, things like that. So I'm sure these are the concerns, but our multinational companies, global companies are very good at getting information about the situation. So, you know, even though I raise general concerns, but the companies you are mentioning, I don't think that they have a big problem. Yeah.
Ambassador Liberto, what do you say about how the dialogue and also the understanding of some of these concerns?
Yeah, just in terms of the question on knowing the U.S. market, being here, look, this I can speak for Samsung here, and I would completely agree with Minister Park in that I think there is a lot of expertise, present company excluded, of course, but I'm kidding. Samsung's been in the U.S. for 40 years. We have 20,000 employees. We opened a Washington, D.C. office, I think 7-8 years ago. And we're in a multitude of states in both sales and marketing, research elements, manufacturing, Texas, South Carolina, Minnesota, Silicon Valley, New York, New Jersey area. I mean, it's a diverse array, and of course, Washington. So I think the sophistication and ability of a company like Samsung to gather information and make assessments is extant. And I would also say, and I'm not speaking for them, but just as an observer, other Korean companies are also in similar situations. We've long seen manufacturing facilities from some of the Hyundai, Kia in Alabama, Georgia. There's Washington offices here. There's headquarters all over the place. So I would just say I think it's a quite sophisticated array of actors on the American scene that have been here for a relatively long period of time. And I'll stop there.
Damien, could you give us instead an idea of how much actually this, you made the statement that, maybe the perception is the United States is a uniform entity, right? But there are major differences culturally across states. So how much do you think these differences are understood?
I don't know if I can speak for Korean companies' understanding because I don't work for a Korean company, but we've done a number of case studies on, for investment, including Chinese foreign investment, obviously, and I'm not really specifically speaking about, cultural differences, but just the fact that, certain states, certain sort of legacy auto states have stronger unions. So that automatically puts companies into sort of union politics, which some foreign investors are not accustomed to and don't necessarily want to deal with. And so that's why you're seeing, I think, including Japanese investors, there has been more manufacturing investment in so-called Sunbelt states because they have less of those kinds of local politics. So there's sort of, so you have to kind of go across. And then obviously when it comes to, clean energy, I don't know as much about chips, but in terms of EVs, there are different consumer subsidies, there are different mandates. California is very different than, say, Mississippi, right? And so all those regional differences is important, obviously, in thinking about where you want to physically place your plant. And I guess the broader point I'll make too is that I think part of it, and I would assume this applies to Korean investors too, is having the policy certainty in the United States. For example, we don't necessarily have a sort of, we may have an EV mandate for, 2030. For example, if you're Hyundai, generally you're making a plant because you're trying to sell to Americans. And you would have to assume that out to 2030, there's enough policy certainty that the people are going to want EVs, that the demand is going to be there, or else why would you drop a 5 to 10 year investment in the United States? So the macro policy uncertainty about how much are we going to adopt electric vehicles is a really important thing to think about for end demand reasons.
Great. I actually want to connect then to you, Naomi. You said, the U.S. is not the only, game in town. I mean, there are different geographies of competition, and maybe some other places think more long-term or provide more of a long-term policy view that the United States is able to provide. How much do you think this is impacting the way in which maybe the South Korean companies think about investments?
Well, it's definitely a big part of the picture. The U.S. is absolutely not the first to think about incentivizing manufacturing in country. And many respects, we're kind of late to the game, especially in East Asia. The incentives are pretty well known in Taiwan and Korea, as well as China. And, we're talking about not only funding, but grants, land grants, tax breaks, things of that nature. So when a company is assessing where to build a plant, they consider all of the things that the panelists have just covered, and the incentives are one of them. I do agree with Damien. The policy environment, the stability of the policy environment is very important, and that does bode well for the U.S. But there are many different considerations.
Thank you very much. I want to move now into this famous question about the supply chain for microchips, and just ask all of you the question about how much this recent developments, for example, the Samsung announcement that it had begun mass production of advanced 3 nanometer microchips, could in fact really help boosting the supply chain resilience in this domain. Dr. Park, can I start with you, and then I will shift the order of speakers. But Dr. Park, let me start with you on this one.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I'm not an expert on this technology stuff, but I also saw the news that the Samsung is now producing kind of a very advanced, the microchips. So I think this is good news for Samsung Electronics, because it can enhance its technological standing in the semiconductor community, and especially it can enhance its competitiveness compared to Chinese semiconductor manufacturing companies, and even maybe it can be competing aggressively with the Taiwanese TSMC. If Samsung Electronics succeed in mass production of advanced microchips, it may improve certainly the semiconductor world market environment, which has been too much dominated by TSMC. In other words, more than sometimes close to 60% of some semiconductors are supplied by TSMC, and Samsung is taking less than 20%. So there needs some more flexibility. So if maybe supply sources of semiconductor could be diversified, not in terms of number of companies, but in terms of amount of supply. So I think it certainly helped bolster supply chain resilience for US companies which are using semiconductor these days. Particularly if you remember, this will contribute to avoiding so-called supply bottlenecks of semiconductor. We had recently experienced, in the couple of years, which had a huge impact on even the automobile production worldwide. So maybe Samsung's role or contribution to increase this kind of microchips, maybe it can enhance the smooth flow of supply chain to semiconductor users, especially in the United States. I'll stop here.
Ambassador Lippert, I want to ask you a different question. Instead of commenting on what Samsung has done, I wanted to ask you whether you can give us a sense of what are the concerns for you when you look at the supply chain of microchips. What, in your view, are the greatest vulnerabilities that we are still unable to address today?
I mean, it's a really good question. And I think first, let me just say, part of the process here is identifying which parts of the supply chain you want to locate close to the customer to build resiliency, et cetera, because I think the Semiconductor Association of America, or SAI, the acronym, I'll just use the acronym. I'm tired, it's late. It's not early, I'm late. So SAI, or SIA, I'm sorry, rather. I think did a study that talked about if you relocate the whole supply chain, it's in trillions of dollars, right? It's just economically unfeasible or infeasible. So I think one part is identification of which nodes where and commercial viability. And the second point I would make is just the demand, right? I mean, let's just look at how demand will add to the complexities of the supply chain issue. The same organization put out a study that said demand will be increased by 56% by 2030, right? So, in addition to the complexities, you've got a growing demand. And I think the final point that I would just make on all of this is then just to come back to the stability of the policymaking environment, right? Because you've got the commercial activities, you've got the nodes, and stability of the policymaking environment, I think are really the things that I watch closely as a private observer, and I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. Damien.
On the chip question, so, chips are quite diverse in terms of types. So when you ask about the 3 nanometer, that's sort of the natural progression. That's the next generation that everyone's chasing after. So it's not just Samsung, TSMC. I'm sure Naomi has thoughts on that too. So this is sort of the natural progression. I'm speaking to you on my Mac. My Mac has a 5 nanometer chip that Apple designed. So when you're talking about that kind of chip, it's really increasingly an oligopolistic structure globally. There are 2 or 3, probably really honestly just 2. So Samsung's obviously competing with TSMC, and TSMC has made it clear that they're moving to 3. Intel's a little behind. To Naomi's point before, it's like a $5 billion investment per fab, right? And one of those machines that's required to make advanced chips is the same price as a Boeing 737. So that's the amount of money you got to drop to make those kinds of chips. And so at the end of the day, you're really looking at 2 or 3 players. It's a bit like the Boeing versus Airbus dynamic in the advanced chip sector, right? So it's not very hard to figure out who's doing what, and because it's just the entry cost is very high, so not many people enter it. And so I think, Samsung, and certainly, I think competition against TSMC is generally a good thing, because TSMC is about 65% of global market share for advanced chips. So having, diversification is good, but it's hard to see that it becomes a more democratized, because only certain fabrications only certain fabs can actually make those kinds of chips, and the Chinese can make the 14 nanometers, 10, they can make memory chips. Samsung make memories, but those are not the kind of advanced chips that we're going to need for, say, autonomous vehicles. So to the extent we believe the future is autonomous vehicles, then we need chips like 3 nanometers.
Damien, could I pick up on this precisely from an economic standpoint? So you don't foresee anytime soon a sort of nationalization of microchips industry. You are not going to see the Chinese wanting to produce their own chips, the Russians wanting to produce their own chips, because it's becoming so strategic.
Oh, they all do. They're all trying, but the Chinese right now can't do the 5 nanometers. And part of that is, I think we've kind of prohibited them from making those chips. Everyone's chasing after 5, 3. Right? Everyone's chasing after, everyone wants it. But I think in terms of who's actually capable, there's like 2 players that are actually capable.
But is it a question of expertise and know-how, or is it a question of material?
It's, like nobody's going to put, it's 5, again, $5 billion, $10 billion here and there. It's not, it's everything. I mean, it's like why there are only, 2 aircraft makers.
I see.
No one else is doing it. It's very hard.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Naomi.
just to pick up on that, I mean, I think the complexity of the chip supply chain and the diversity of vendors really can't be overstated. And there's sort of this big picture aspiration from the government side where, yes, you hear a lot of governments saying, we want to manufacture these types of chips. We want everything done here. We want to be the leader. And when the rubber meets the road, that's just not how it works. The supply chain will always remain inherently global. And so what governments really need to do is be more strategic and figure out the types of chips that they need or want closer to home, or to have an allied partner that they know it will continue to manufacture those chips. But just having everything in one spot is not necessarily the best solution, because as we saw with the pandemic, there are multiple factors that influence risks in supply chain and destabilize the supply chain. And you can't always predict those, whether they're natural or man-made catastrophes or geopolitical instability. These are all reasons why the supply chain needs to be diversified. So any government that professes that they're going to build the next, take the next step and build everything at home, it's just a lot of posturing at the end of the day, fortunately and unfortunately. And also, I think when we talk about these issues, there's not a lot of digging into the weeds on how companies work together. You have chip manufacturers, but you also have the fabulous chip companies and chip equipment makers, and who makes what type of silicon, and what type of particles, and things that are way beyond my area of scientific expertise. And these are all really important, and yes, very few companies in some of these cases can do that type of manufacturing. So it's important to understand that different companies have their areas of specialization and expertise, and it's the supply chain and the way that these companies have made their deals and partnerships over years that have made it efficient and allowed for innovation and growth. And then governments can help that innovation and growth by incentivizing and making it easier to build fabs, to find expertise, and to forge trade partnerships with the companies that they want, and to import or export the components that they need.
Yeah, just think about it this way. Apple is now a chip company. They're a chip designer, but they can't make that chip. TSMC makes that chip for them, but they are a legitimate, they make one of the best chips on the market now, Apple, or design one anyway, right? So.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I proceed with the another one. And Naomi, let me begin with you. This shifts a little bit the conversation from the technology per se into more of a geopolitical conversation. And the rhetoric in Washington today, left and right, is that we need to decouple from China. So China's decoupling, which very few people understand exactly what that means, in what sectors, how is it going to be done? It's an important part of the political discussion today. And so from a manufacturing perspective, how can the US decouple from China and add tech supply chain resilience at the same time? Can it be done without China?
Yeah, so supply chain resilience and decoupling are two different things. Resilience implies a risk-based approach and an awareness of what can destabilize a supply chain. And as I was just referencing, there are various factors. Geopolitics are one of them, but natural and man-made disasters can be another, pandemics, as we've seen, and just supply chain disruptions in the form of tariffs or disagreements between countries. So, when the decoupling discussion really needs to go away, frankly. I mean, it's just not a productive discussion. There's no need to decouple. It's not beneficial from either a security perspective or a business perspective. Of course, there will always be specialized technology that is sensitive and needs to be protected, and that's where export controls come into play. But the notion that simply selling to the Chinese market or manufacturing certain parts in the Chinese market is an inherent security risk, that needs to be questioned. That's not a risk-based approach. And policymakers need to be thinking through the ramifications of these decisions if they're going to, try to implement something that's very cut and dry. And that's why it's so important that the private sector and the public sector work together to understand this whole hugely complex picture, so that government officials can get a better sense of these are where the risks are, these are where the vulnerabilities are from a supply chain perspective, from a technology perspective, and this is how we, the company, mitigate against it. But China's a huge market, and it's not going away anytime soon as either a market or a hub for manufacturing. And it shouldn't go away. And I think companies have developed strategies where if there is a concern with a cutting edge technology, they might use legacy technology that is a couple generations behind, but there is certainly a place for that.
Naomi, can I pick up on one concept? This risk-based approach, which I really I think is really important. What needs to be done to make sure that this framework actually becomes part of this narrative and not the decoupling one, which I agree means very little? So what needs to be done to make sure that we adopt a risk-based approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a complicated topic, so it's difficult to get people to talk in different ways about it without understanding the nuance. But to kind of simplify it, if we're looking specifically at the threat that policymakers see in China, I would say from a risk approach, which scenario is more likely? Like, ask yourself, if you a company sell chips to a Chinese company, are they going to be able to successfully reverse engineer those chips and put in all the time and resources and expertise that it takes to reverse engineer a infinitesimally small piece of high-tech technology? Or is it more likely that any company or government might potentially bribe an employee to get the expertise directly from someone who knows how to do it? I think the latter is much more likely. So that's what I mean in terms of thinking about, the most likely scenarios. How do we guard against that? We've already seen China invest billions upon billions of dollars into chips. And as Damien said, they're still behind. So to a certain extent, let them spend the money. Let them try to compete. And if they can compete on the merits, great. But, so far their model hasn't worked. And they're still a huge market. They still make some, good previous generation type of chips. But I don't think they're a threat at the moment to the global ecosystem in the way that tends to be discussed right now.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Damien, how is your view about this?
About decoupling versus resilience, or just decoupling?
Relationship.
I mean, I think I would agree. It's a bit of a vague term, and I'm not quite sure exactly what it means in reality, in the practical sense. I think the way to think about it, I would caution people when they talk about decoupling. If we're serious about, sort of like the most extreme version of that is sort of like just completely severed ties, or whatever you want to call it. That is probably going to be inflationary if you really just sever ties right away. And any disruption to sort of very integrated ecosystems like that is going to be probably inflationary. And in the current environment of, we all know what inflation is like now, that's probably not a good outcome. And I think we need to weigh that against how much do we want the clean energy transition to be, because that's really what we're talking about. Things are going to get more expensive because there will be a switching cost for companies. and that cost is going to get passed down. And so we don't really know how that's going to affect inflation or a cost of a number of these inputs that are necessary, for example, to build an EV. I'm coming back to that because this is the area where there's a lot of transition happening. And so how expensive do we want that to be? EVs are already about 20-30% more expensive than your normal gasoline car. So do we really want to pay another 40% extra for those cars? That would slow down that transition. So that's sort of the implication. So we have to think through, we talk about supply chain resilience. We have to think about the entire supply chain of consequences when we talk about decoupling, right? And I would bet it's going to have a more inflationary effect, and that's probably that's just not something I think consumers would want to tolerate in the current environment.
Thank you, Ambassador Lippert. I have the question about the relation between resilience and decoupling, but also I wanted to ask your view. Naomi talked about, at some point, export control policies can do exactly what, we would like to do with China, right? But for some reasons, politically, these export control policies don't seem to be sufficient anymore. Could you give us a sense of why do you think is the case?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in this conversation. Sort of which handle to grab. Let me just try to say first, on your broader question about why there's probably a need to do this. I'm speaking analytically from someone who works in Washington. I think what has happened is, one, the geopolitical situation has changed dramatically over the last 5 to 7 years, bringing the political spectrum in Washington to more of a right of center or a hawkish view, whatever that is, on China. The other thing I think, and the great Ash Carter in his book about his time at the Pentagon recognized this, which is he said, look, technology, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, apologies, Ash, used to be the Pentagon developed the technology, controlled it, and exported it, right? It was a kind of a government-run process. And he said, today, technology is more commercially available, more diffuse, and therefore more difficult to control. And I think those two things are at the heart of some of this conversation. Second point I want to make is, I think Mr. Ma made a really good point in terms of just, there's a transition happening, right? I think it dovetails with my first point. And I think you're seeing, it'll come to my third point, which is, I think you're seeing an unsettled Washington between decoupling, whatever the definition is, full decoupling, to this risk-based analysis type of structure. And I think you look at the CHIPS Act and what's in it in terms of the guardrails, it looks like it fences off certain technologies and really is not, and then you've got that plus your export control regime, kind of seeing that in tandem. So I think I think it's very much a work in progress. And you looked at the debate over this over the course of several months, and it changed several times. So it just underscores, I think, the nature of Washington. Finally, on, I think, the other point that Mr. Ma made in terms of factors that come into this is, I think one could argue the 301, 232 actions under President Trump were an effort at decoupling, or at least a complementary tool. And right now, there is debate in Washington about which 301 tariffs to roll back, right? So I think it all underscores the unsettled nature of this, the geopolitical, economic, in terms of inflationary, as well as technological things, all coming to a head in a policymaking environment in Washington that, again, is unsettled and I think in a bit uncertain. And I think this is one of the great debates we're going to have over the next several years in terms of foreign and technological and economic policy. Let me just stop there. I think our moderator just dropped. Technological issue.
Thanks for that heads up. We're having some power outages in the greater Boston area with the heat and everyone turning on their AC. Thank you for your flexibility here. With the questions here, we're heading in a great direction in terms of laying different aspects to a very complex question. And so with this, I wanted to proceed with looking at how, when we focus on the alliance, what role does a resilient tech supply chain play in the broader security alliance between the United States and South Korea? And with that, if you could start off with Dr. Pak.
Well, before I respond to your question, I want to go back to
Sure.
the decoupling issues. We have to understand the background why U.S. is arguing about decoupling against China or in a few areas. But general people are confused because what kind of decoupling we are talking about. So at least we have to consider limiting the U.S. decoupling from China to a few technologically sensitive sectors, which may be closely related to directly the national security, like semiconductor and batteries for electric vehicles. I can assure you that these days the U.S. economy and other economies of the world are deeply interconnected with Chinese economy. I'm talking about general phenomena. This is done through globalization for many years so far. So if you can see while U.S.-China dispute continues, if you look at the trade between U.S. and China, last year U.S. import more from China and increase the trade deficit against China. So we cannot simply sever all trade with China overnight. So even in this case of semiconductor, microchips, whatever, I think the decoupling should focus on also a few technologically advanced chips, not the general semiconductor industry. Because otherwise, Korean semiconductor companies will lose the Chinese market, which is the largest market for Korean companies for their sales of semiconductor. Last year, almost 40% of Korea's semiconductor export go to China, and this number will increase to 60% if we include Korean semiconductor exports to Hong Kong. So without Chinese market, Korean companies cannot survive. And in this situation, how can we talk about complete decoupling or in the semiconductor industry from China? So I think this will be a very sensitive and important issue in the coming years. I will come back to the role of high-tech tech supply chain in the security area later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great to see Dr. Giovannini back on the line. We're here looking at the question, and we just started this round. I'll turn it back to you, looking at the role that resilient tech supply chain plays in the broader security alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. Over to you, Dr. Giovannini. Thanks for rejoining.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to apologize profusely. I'm having power outages all day today. And so if I disappear again, it's not because I find this conversation really boring. I love this conversation. So my apologies to go back and forth. I hope that doesn't happen again.
That's not good for EV infrastructure. I think that's a bad leading indicator.
It is. Dr. Park, you were addressing the question about what role does a resilient tech supply chain play in the broader security alliance?
Okay. Well, you know that one of the key areas of the U.S. Indo-Pacific economic framework we talked about a little bit already is a supply chain resilience. One of the pillars is supply chain resilience, especially for high-tech sectors such as semiconductor or batteries for electric vehicles. The main reason for the U.S. to focus on resilience tech supply chain is because it is critically important for national security, especially when the U.S. compete with China. So during the last May Korea-US summit meeting, Korean President Yoon showed President Biden Korea's strong interest in joining the IPEF. I mean, the negotiation didn't start yet, but so we expect Korea will actively participate in the upcoming negotiations on IPEF. I think Korea's participation in establishing a resilient tech supply chain with the United States will not only broaden the nature of the alliance between Korea and US, but also it can play an important role in strengthening the security situations in the Indo-Pacific region. Only thing we may be concerned about would be China's reaction to tech supply chain, which exclude China. I mean, these are the real concern in Korea, because we are very close to China in terms of economic activities. That's why our science technology minister show that joining the Fab 4 or Chip 4 kind of alliance, they are a little bit considering the reaction from China at the moment. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Very, very important question. Ambassador Lippert, how do you see this relationship?
I'm sorry, you broke up just a little bit.
Sorry. What role do you think like this resilient supply chain can be as part of the broader security alliance?
Between the United States and the Republic of Korea.
Right.
I mean, I would just, at the risk of repeating myself from the first question, I do think it's an important pillar. I think it adds to two very strong pillars, both in terms of the FTA between Korea and the U.S. and the security relationship, which is, a full-fledged mutual defense treaty alliance relationship. So I think that's an important piece. The other element I would add is that this is all part of what I used to call, when I was ambassador, the new frontiers, and actually Foreign Minister Park Jin has been calling it as well, to expand the alliance into 21st century issues, ranging from global health, where we've seen cooperation between the U.S. and Republic of Korea, environment, energy, space, the cyber, fourth industrial revolution. You see the broadening of the alliance, I would call it modernizing of the alliance, bringing into the alliance more and different diverse constituencies, versus if you go way back several decades, it was principally military personnel and security experts and analysts. It's now a much broader based group of constituencies. And I would, again, underscore that it is something that it helps point the relationship into a direction befitting and underscoring the dynamics of the 21st century. And let me just stop there.
Thank you very much. Damien.
I don't know if I have that much to add on this particular question. I think, of course, I think when it comes to resilience, South Korea and United States, that's got to be a big part of. It's got to be a big part. I mean, as I had talked about before, when you look around, when you look at what are the handful of companies that can realistically make and supply those kinds of midstream inputs, right? Chips, batteries, down to the downstream, the EVs. There aren't that many. So when you look to East Asia, you're looking at basically two countries, Japan and South Korea. And South Korea, frankly, makes more chips now, and so that just makes total economic sense. But I think, again, if we wrap everything under just sort of a national security umbrella, we also have to think about sort of like, okay, does it also make economic sense for those companies? To Dr. Park's earlier point, China's 40% of their chips market. That's significant. As long as China makes the world's consumer electronics, they're going to need chips. There's no way around that, right? Because what we're talking about are midstream inputs, but China makes the end products where those things are going to go to. And so, unless we start make a bunch of, cell phones in the United States or elsewhere, then okay, then maybe, we'll get that. But so we have to think about, kind of balance that with sort of what are the economic realities that are happening right now across the world.
Thank you very much. Naomi.
Yeah, I would just tag on to that by saying, the goal shouldn't be to just cut off China, and that is not a sound supply chain security strategy. The goal should be to compete with China. And I think some of these conversations about supply chain alliances get oversimplified in the media. What does that mean when you get down to the details? And I would say there are a few things that both the US and Korea can work on to facilitate that. First is making sure that the policy environments in both the US and Korea are as welcoming as possible to businesses. And so that means incentives that are open not just to domestic companies. Everybody loves the government rhetoric of basically saying we support our domestic companies. And of course, every government wants to support their homegrown domestic companies. But also there needs to be a recognition of the benefits of that direct investment into their country. And I think that both the US and Korea absolutely recognize that. In particular, the new Yoon administration has messaged very strongly that they're open to more direct investment, that they want the market to work for the Korean economy. So there are regulatory changes that both countries can make or be mindful of in order to facilitate those partnerships. And the other is, creating space for companies to have successful partnerships. And that, means connecting companies that work on one part of the supply chain with the other company and making sure that they have the opportunity to work together, that there isn't a political cloud hanging over it, or there aren't regulatory hurdles that they have to jump through. At the end of the day, the goal needs to be to compete and to diversify the supply chain. And I think there's a lot that the US and Korea can do together to achieve that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. I have one last one that I would like to pose to the panelists, but please post your question in the Q&A, and we'll definitely address it. In the meantime, as the questions come in, I want to ask one last question, and I want to build on what Tammy mentioned before, which is really another narrative or another attempt today to think about technology competition and geopolitical questions. And this is the question between democracies and authoritarian regimes. And more specifically, the idea, at least in Washington, to launch a global alliance, a global tech alliance among democracies. And you're all experts of technology, trade, and I would like to know, what is your thinking behind this? I mean, is this an idea that can work, or is it an idea that has no leverage? So Naomi, can I start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think for many administrations, ensuring the stability of democracies across the globe is very important. And so it's understandable that they would want to thread this into one of the main political and technological issues of our time. But, I do think care needs to be taken in terms of how that will play out. I like the Singapore narrative of, rules-based, not necessarily democracy, because, different democracies are at different levels or different adherence to those types of principles. But, generally speaking, having open trade and an open regulatory environment, I think does produce very good outcomes. And, if countries are playing by the rules and held accountable, then I think that's a really good step in terms of supporting the rules-based order and ultimately, supporting that democratic mindset.
Damien.
Well, on the regime type question, I think it was Winston Churchill, right, who said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other ones that's been tried from time to time. So I think I'll answer this very simply and very quickly. And I'm going to go back to your original dichotomy of overestimation and underestimation. I think we have a tendency to overestimate regime type and we underestimate results and the actual, what the system can deliver. Let's, whatever, we can talk about regime type all day long, but at the end of the day, what succeeds is sort of, how does that system deliver what it needs to do? And if either system don't, then I don't think we should be emphasizing regime type all the time, because it seems to not really, it ultimately is not going to matter unless the results show which system, is competitive, is more competitive. And so I think that's so we should, put more emphasis on results rather than regime type all the time.
Fantastic. Ambassador Lippert.
Without, commenting on the technological alliance, I think it's a situation where the what really matters. So sort of speculating in hypothetical terms, pretty tough to do without seeing the what. What I would say though is a general rule. I'm just a big believer in when you can work with your friends, partners, allies around the world to support an open, rules-based international order, you're going to be better off, and the world's going to be better off. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Dr. Park.
Well, we talk about so-called rules-based order or system. Unfortunately, we used to have a WTO, which can provide lots of rules and for trade and investment. But especially when China becomes economically growing and have more power, doesn't tend to be abiding by the rules, especially the subsidy disciplines or investment rules, things like that. This is the starting point of so-called decoupling or whatever that kind of issues, because U.S. consider so-called state capitalism of China is causing a lot of problem, over facility, oversupply, and also sometimes they don't respect intellectual property rights and they force investors to transfer technology. So all kind of things become the base for this kind of competition or dispute between China and United States. So Singapore prime minister or minister says that the rules-based kind of system will be the target. We all go for it. For that, I think we have to improve the WTO system, because last month we have a so-called ministerial conference was held, and they don't agree too much. But I think we want to make WTO more flexible and also more adaptable to the newly rising issues like digital trade, whatever. So what I want to say is that in the end, we want to see the system, new governance, which can provide lots of flexible activities to all the countries who are abiding by these rules and disciplines, which is much better than decoupling and excluding some countries. So I hope, but it's very difficult to have this kind of governance. But the world leaders should consider establishing, again, the new 24th century governance on international commerce. This is our really hope to achieve in the future. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so let me take some of the questions that are coming in. Many. So I want to start with Timothy Richards, who asked, today the Wall Street Journal published an article titled "Chips Measure Clears First Hurdle in Senate" by Natalie Andrews. And Timothy asked the following question: will the subsidies to boost US chip production affect future trade hurdles with other countries, since this might affect the supply and demand chain, thus lowering the cost of worldwide chips as the chips are produced in America? And then he asked, and what are the effects on South Korea and the trade with South Korea as well? Damien, Naomi, who wants to take this question?
I think that's Naomi. I'm gonna designate it. I don't know.
So mindful of the fact that the CHIPS Act is changing like by the hour. The latest that I'm aware of, I don't see any significant trade impacts in the negative sense. I mean, ultimately, the incentives that are offered through the CHIPS Act should be open to all reasonable interested parties, including Korean companies. And so I don't see a trade deterrence effect there. Whether it drives prices down, yeah, I have no real economic expertise or insight to lend there.
All right. So Jacqueline Chang asked another very important question. If you were to look at the countries who have the rare earth minerals necessary for chip manufacturing, who would you say has the most influence with the majority of those countries? And if not the US, what would the US need to do to counter? Damien.
Sure, I can take that as I've looked into the rare earth issue. Although I'm not quite sure I understand the question. The question is, who has
more influence over the countries that do actually have rare minerals? And if the US doesn't have the leverage, what should the US do?
Okay, so I guess first, slight corrective. Rare earth is mostly used for EVs, permanent magnets and motors, not too much for chips as far as I understand it. So it's really sort of a EV question, and batteries, or not really the batteries, but really the motors and the permanent magnets. I guess I'll answer it this way. China doesn't have China produces a lot of rare earths, but it doesn't have a monopoly on global reserves. So I think the simple way to think about the rare earth issue, it's really just a mining issue. It's a mining problem, and we need to decide whether certain countries will want to mine it, because we have it in the United States. Australia has it. Many other countries have deposits and reserves. So it's not a question of reserves. It's about, do we want to get it out of the ground? And the Chinese have decided they were the ones that were going to get it out of the ground. So for a while, they were dominating in 90% of global production. Now they're down to like 65% of global production. So there's already been some diversification. But if we really want to, continue to kind of diversify, then it comes down to mining. And that gets into environmental issues, that gets into each country's regulatory, and so it gets pretty complicated. And that's really why we shut down our rare earth in California, is because of environmental regulations. So if we decide we want to mine, and if you think about EVs, right, it's mostly kind of, it's all about metals, the batteries. So it's all about mining. So we have to think of, so mining, we have to think about where do we want to mine this stuff. And if we don't want to mine it in the United States or somewhere else, then then we have to decide, where do we want to rely on those commodities. So
Damien, let me ask you a follow-up question on Jacqueline's point. The fact that, for example, China has so many trade agreements with African countries, for example, how much you think is going to change the calculations here on mining, for example, the ability for China to influence these countries to do mining?
Well, yeah, China has really invested in cobalt mines in the Congo, because again, it's all about the battery. It's all about the EVs, right? And so you have some cobalt there, but a lot of manufacturers are trying to diversify away from cobalt to kind of, because cobalt is expensive. Then, of course, if you want to talk about lithium, because all batteries are lithium, then you're talking about Latin America, the lithium triangle. and China has some activities there. But, let me give you one example. People don't know this, but Bolivia is the Saudi Arabia of lithium. Okay. And it's just sitting there. They're not doing anything with it. So again, we need to, yes, people have reserves, but like, are we going to get it out of the ground? And if not, does it matter that they have reserves? Lithium is another thing. And, lithium prices have spiked, ridiculously high over last year because of the demand for batteries, right? And that's going to continue to be the case. So again, it's a mining issue, and we need to decide, do we want to mine these metals or not to meet increasing demand?
Yeah. Thank you. I have another question, and this one is for Dr. Park. Jessica Taylor asked, in the semiconductor space, should the South Korea-US alliance include security guarantees that seek to address China's willingness to weaponize its economy? And if so, what would that look like? And Jessica Taylor is a former USFK geopolitical strategist. And Dr. Park, this question is for you. Should we include security guarantees?
Well, security guarantee cannot actually include the secure stable supply of materials and parts and components. This is a really important issue. That's why Korea cannot willingly coming to joining the Chip 4 or Fab 4 or even strategic alliance for high-tech supply chain resilience, because we are heavily depend on China in terms of importing large amount of key materials. I think I don't know the exact number, maybe more than 200 key materials we are using for our manufacturing, general manufacturing, or even semiconductors or batteries for EV. More than 80%, 9% we are depending on China. So even though we include some kind of security things, if China weaponize the exporting their own materials to Korea, then the Korea cannot really survive actually. So we really want to. That's why I want to go back to the rules-based kind of system in the future, because U.S. is putting more subsidies on semiconductor by using CHIP Act or whatever, and European is doing the same thing. But we used to complain or criticizing China because they are putting so much money in high-tech industries. But we are doing the same thing. We are competing by subsidizing all kinds of sectors. Then in the end, we are all losing. So that's why we sooner or later, we should consider establishing a new kind of governance which can control the subsidies and investment rules, digital trade and environment within the system. Otherwise, we are competing to each other, and we know that from textbook, retaliation to each other will only end up losing game rather than winning game. Yeah.
Thank you. Naomi, this is a question for you and possibly for Damien. Nina Fernandez asked, as TSMC and Samsung Electronics intensify their competition for next generation of chip dominance, who do you see emerging ahead and why?
I guess that's $1 million question, or at least $1 million. Place your bets on the stock market. So I don't know who will win. What I can say is that the competition is the important piece. It's not, when we talk about these issues, a lot of times we like to talk in terms of who will win, who will get there first, winners, losers. If the competitiveness ecosystem works the way it should, it should all drive competition and innovation. And companies should be specializing in the areas where they have the expertise and they have a particular advantage in the market. And don't forget, the companies are not only competitors, but they're each other's customers. Especially in the semiconductor ecosystem. So I really don't think it's as I don't think it's as simple as who will get there first or who will win. But we should all be pushing for more competition if we want to get those next big technologies.
Damien, what do you think?
Well, no company wins forever. I think just look at Intel was obviously a global leader for quite some time, and now it's definitely in terms of the advanced fabrication of chips, it's fallen behind a company like TSMC, and they're trying to catch up. So I think there's always cyclical falling and rising, and some companies have invested well, and some companies have decided to go a different direction. So I wouldn't put my money on anybody, but I think, again, I go back to, I think you're looking at these high entry cost industries is going to get sort of at max maybe 2 or 3 major players, and so you kind of look at them, and those are probably going to be the leaders. Whether they'll win at any given time, who knows? But sort of you're probably going to get sort of a Trinity, or at max maybe 4, because you're just not going to be able to get too many other ones that are going to get there in any meaningful period of time.
Thank you. Dr. Park, this is again another question for you, which is more on the geopolitical and security side. Stephen Alles, who is a Harvard graduate student in international relations, asked, Korea, Japan, and in most instances, China compete as the world's largest consumers of LNG. How does the growing scarcity of global LNG resources affect the South Korea effectiveness to produce and export its goods in the context of a healthy supply chain flow to grow their economy? We've not talked about energy security very much in this panel, but it's a really important question. So what do you say about the concerns of South Korea to be able to export its goods at a competitive price?
Well, we already got hurt because of the rise of raw materials and energy, LNGs, whatever. So we don't produce any energy domestically. I mean, we all import oil and gas, and then use that and manufacture, the petrochemical products and export to the world. So obviously, the price, we produce is increasing. So I think right now our government is trying to really diversify the sources of imports of energies. We are looking at not only Middle East, but also even United States and Canada and Australia. So we are really diversifying our energy sources for our manufacturing sector. This is the only thing we can do at the moment. But we are actually suffering from global inflation, obviously.
And Dr. Park, can I ask, how much do you think the Ukraine war will further impact the market in general and the South Korean economy?
Well, so far, we are not directly impacted from the war. I mean, Europeans are most directly impacted the region, but indirectly, we are facing huge rise in oil prices and energy prices, and also the agricultural product price is also increasing. We are also importing a lot of agricultural product to our own economy. So even though these wars doesn't really directly impact on the Korean economy, but we are indirectly impacted. But we are also hoping that maybe in the future, we will be in position to help Ukraine reconstruct their own economy, because we are very good at that, in construction and other things. So hopefully we want to see this war end soon, and then Korea and other countries can help Ukraine rebuild their own economy.
Could I turn to you, both Naomi and Damien, in your assessments of the supply chain vulnerabilities, how much does energy security, features into these examinations, and what is your estimate about how energy insecurity will affect the supply chain? Naomi, can I start with you?
I'm always going to bump that to Damien. That's not really my area of expertise.
Damien, what do you think?
Energy security when it comes to supply chains. Well, I do think that energy security has been on the idea of energy security has been on the rise, in part because of geopolitical conflict that you mentioned, but also because of inflationary pressures. And I think we're seeing some difficulties in being able to meaningfully replace reliable baseload power with just renewables, right? And so you're seeing obviously the Germans might be going back into coal. China's doing more coal a little bit now in the immediate term. Doesn't mean it's going to swing all the way back, but certainly right now, I think the idea of the notion of energy security is dominating policy making more than probably decarbonization because of the current volatility and inflationary pressures, and that's going to be important, and that's something that I think we need to probably think about as a global economy, sort of how disruptive. Both sort of, ensuring energy security on the one end, but sort of how fast we need to be going on decarbonization, because that again has proven that it's obviously something we want to pursue, but the pace and the sequence and the kind of disruption that it's going to bring is something that we can see that, at least here in America, consumers are very fixated on gas prices, and so that's something that I think is going to increasingly be something that I don't think we have a very good way of thinking about how to balance it just yet, right? And so and will it affect supply chains overall? Sure, if energy cost goes up for a lot of these firms, yeah, then they're going to stop production. So absolutely. I mean, we had the incident in China at the end of 2021, very significant unanticipated blackouts because of energy shortage, and they had to actually stop production in many provinces. So that contributed even a little bit more to the supply chain crunch that we saw in 2021.
All right, so let me ask another question, which is a more sort of broad question. So what else can governments do?
Ooh, I think we lost our moderator again.
We
It's a
did.
cliffhanger.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna.
Energy security, just man, talk about energy insecurity.
So, Damien, we went to great lengths to accelerate the illustration of your points here. So it's working. So the question that Dr. Giovannini was getting to was looking at what more can governments do to accelerate building tech supply chain resilience? What can they do that they're currently not doing? And so if I could start with Naomi on that one, that would be great.
So I would say generally it's not a one size fits all solution, and governments need to keep talking with the private sector and understand the dynamics of the changing situation and the changing technology, and help work through where are the bottlenecks, where are the potential points of failure, and hear from the private sector too. What can government do that will be effective and will help us in the long run?
Thank you. And same question, Dr. Pak. What can governments do to accelerate building tech supply chain resilience that they're currently not doing?
Well, actually, Naomi rightly mentioned that even in Korea, government is now surveying or investigating the bottlenecks of the resources or materials or parts and components we are depending on foreign countries. So by doing that, but if you want to do that, you have to have a very close conversation with the private sector. I think the more important thing in the future is that the government should, communicate with private sector together. But the thing is, private sectors don't want to reveal the information with other private sectors. This is a problem. But I think if you want to jointly defend this kind of problem in the future, I think we have to share the information, and especially with the government. One thing which I heard, very interesting story from one of the global company CEO, is that they are now preparing for so-called vertical integration from the bottom to the top. It doesn't mean that they want to do themselves, but they want to have a control of each stages of vertical integration. So we are moving really against opposite direction to the globalization. So I think the firms are feeling this kind of situation very seriously, and I think in the future government and private sector jointly discuss about how to establish a more safe supply chain in the future.
Thank you. And Damien, same question in terms of what more governments can do to accelerate building this kind of resiliency in the tech supply chains.
Well, I think well, there are a couple ways to kind of dissect that question. I guess if hypothetically speaking, if we are serious about wanting to reshore or friendshore, there's the option of I think I mentioned there's going to be a switching cost, right? If we actually want to kind of tear away from the current supply chain and kind of move it to places, whether will government subsidize that? That's one. Will the government subsidize the switching cost? Because I think that's something that companies are going to ask. And two, I think related to what Naomi and Dr. Bach said, which is, I think it will be good if not just the U.S. government, but all governments could do more of a holistic assessment of, really get down to the details of what are we actually missing that is of critical importance. What is the scarcest thing that we don't have? For one thing, we did a case study on permanent magnets, and throughout our whole research, it turns out we don't have any single permanent magnet production capacity in the United States, so zero. So that might constitute as something we might want. So but I think it doesn't apply to every single sector. So I think we just need to have a more granular understanding of what is the most severe deficient thing that we have, and whether that's important enough for us to actually make it domestically, or we have reliable partners to actually supply it to us. So I think both subsidizing switching costs possibly, or having a really holistic understanding of what we're missing.
So Naomi, I wanted to actually go back to a comment that Dr. Giovannini mentioned. She brought up the effects of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war on South Korea's economy. If you look at it from the angle of, basically after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US and several other countries have increased their use of export controls on high-tech goods, including chips. So do these type of export controls and sanctions cause difficulties for South Korean companies?
Yeah, there's never a simple answer, and there's never a one-size-fits-all solution. Export controls are one tool in a toolbox, and certainly, with the Ukraine situation, we're in a very difficult and unprecedented time, and governments are looking at all tools in their disposal, as they should. But to think of export controls as a panacea would be misguided. And there are ramifications. Anytime you do something to interrupt trade or disrupt supply chains, there's going to be a cost attached to that. And so it's really for the government to weigh, are the costs worth the benefits? Whatever message you're trying trying to send, whether it's a national security issue or to try to put economic pressure on another government. Those are all considerations. But in terms of how much it hurts specific economies, it's tough to say. It's tough to say in the immediate aftermath, and we don't know how long these policies will be in place. Looking at another policy that has been highly disruptive, tariffs, which remain in place on billions of dollars worth of products. That we're continuing to see the negative impacts and the long-term impacts of that policy. So, looking at what you're trying to achieve, understanding what the second and third order consequences are, and what is your tolerance for those ramifications, that should be all part of the policy discussion.
Thanks for that, Amy. Dr. Pak, you mentioned at the outset, you were looking at it from the perspective of globalization, and you essentially saw companies searching the world for lowest unit costs, intertwined supply chains. As we see, as Dr. Giovannini was mentioning, the application of these types of economic statecraft tools on Russia, how do you see that potentially affecting Korean companies as well? So similar type of question to you.
Well, you mentioned the export control. I mean, I don't know the exact statistics, but we are not really trading very much with Russia. So, generally speaking, for that matter, we are not very much, get affected. However, many individual firms, small and large, they are checking the government whether their activities is a violation of this export control, which is not very clear. I mean, U.S. export control is not easy to understand. So lots of discussions, and also talking to U.S. Law firm whether this type of export is violation of this export control, because we are keen to the export control by United States, because if we violate, then we can have a lot of negative impacts from U.S. government. So so far the magnitude of the damages or problems is not that big, but if this lasts longer, then Korean firms will have a hard time in abiding by these export control rules in many different areas. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for layering the aspect of trying to decipher for private sector companies how to abide by some of these measures coming down. Damien, to you, another question that came in is how important is cybersecurity to tech supply chain resilience? Have recent ransomware attacks on major companies, such as a Colonial Pipeline in the US last year, affect South Korean businesses thinking on this issue? How you perceive South Korean businesses as they view these type of cybersecurity threats?
Frankly, I really don't know that much about the cybersecurity side of things. So I don't know if maybe Naomi or maybe Dr. Pak have more thoughts on that. I wouldn't really know what to comment on that exactly. So.
Sure. Naomi?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that cybersecurity and network security are a huge part of any multinational company's daily operations, and it is their lifeblood. It is how they communicate with their customers and manage all of their data, and of course, protect that data. So in terms of a direct link to the supply chain, I'm not sure that I would draw that parallel, but a disruption to business, and certainly that is part of the supply chain and the predictability and the smoothness of operations, that it would definitely have an impact.
So the next question, Dr. Pak, I think this one would be very well suited for your expertise. As South Korean companies continue to invest both in China and the United States, when it comes to technology companies, particularly in microchips and so forth, how do you see Chinese economic statecraft when it comes to coercion? We've heard earlier references to THAAD and how China applied that economic pressure on South Korea. Is there any new thinking, or are there ideas in terms of how to address that? Because the whole basic exposure to both marketplaces presents a certain type of vulnerability. What is the latest thinking in South Korea related to this issue?
Well, actually, Korea's investment in China is decreasing, not because of US-China disputes, but the business environment, including the level of wages. Now, Chinese wages are rising very rapidly. I understand that the per capita GDP of China is now $10,000, while the per capita GDP in Vietnam is less than $3,000. So naturally, Korean firms are moving, leaving China and making more investment in other ASEAN areas or India. So this kind of current situation, we are making more investment in United States, not because of as a pattern of globalization. This is more like a strategic kind of movement. But so far, the so-called decoupling or other, coalition of supply chain partners is not firmed up yet. So we don't know what China is reacting to this. But obviously, these days, Chinese leaders or some officials are saying that Korea should not join the IPF or should not join the Chip 4 alliances. But this time it may be different from SARC case, because we are not directly doing something with the only United States. All kinds of activities are being done with the other people, like IPF, 14 countries, PEF4 is 4 countries. So I don't think China will directly cause Korea in many areas. However, they are considering something to not retaliate, but giving hard time to Korea. We don't know exactly how China will react, but we are concerned about that. But it may not be the same case as THAAD case this time.
Thank you. As we go to our last 2 questions in the queue here, the question that comes up is, when you address the topic of resilient supply chains, we heard earlier in the conversation related to the costs and how it is cost intensive and it will take time. What do you think is the greatest point that we need to consider in terms of managing expectations as we see the greater focus on trying to increase the resilience of technology supply chains? So if I could start with you, Damien.
Sorry, the question is the expectations of how successful we're going to be, or in terms of the outcome of supply chain resilience, or?
Sure. So it seems like with the question that we received here, there's an expectation that once we have this type of focus on building supply chain resilience and technology, we have the announcements of investments coming in and Samsung Electronics building factories in the United States. There's a sense that we're moving very quickly, but when it comes to important managing of expectations, what would that be for you?
I think building up a lot of supply chains from scratch or supply chain resilience is probably a 5 to 10 year effort. And I think, yes, there's going to be a flood of uninvestment, but it's going to take a while for those plants to get built, for them to actually start production. And so this is not something that you can snap your fingers and it's going to be done overnight. And again, I think it's been stressed over and over again, is that this is more or less a industry, private sector led effort for the most part. Government can do certain things, government can coordinate, government can sort of, provide information. But at the end of the day, the decisions are being made by the companies themselves. And they have to these kind of harder technologies, right? We're not talking about apps. We're not talking about, software. We're talking about physical plants where you're manufacturing very complicated tech. That's a big investment, and that's going to take some time for that to actually bear fruit.
Thanks for that, Damien. Naomi, same question.
Yeah, I would just say that it's a longer term endeavor. That's the primary expectation that I would manage. One investment, one business deal is great, but it does not overnight make any country the new hub for supply chains and semiconductor technology.
Thank you. And Dr. Buck, you referenced the rules-based approach and the necessity for that as you laid out some of your early comments. For you, what do you think when it comes to our audience's perspective here? What are some considerations that are important in managing expectations as there's a greater focus in building out this kind of resilience in tech supply chains?
Well, I didn't think about that very, very deeply, but the one thing we are concerned in Korea is this, because, when we talk about the tech supply chain resilience, this is like a highly competitive situation in technology. So, if we invest in the United States, maybe Samsung or LG or Hynix, SK Hynix, if they want to M&A of small research-oriented US companies, this kind of situation will prevent the US government from thoroughly investigating the situation, so that they may not allow the M&A for Korean companies. We are concerned because we are making a lot of investment, but even if you want to have M&A with the research companies in the United States, if our Korean companies have huge businesses in China, then maybe this kind of M&A is likely to be turned down through CFIUS or some kind of foreign direct investment screening system of the United States. So when we talk about overestimating, underestimating kind of situation in the first question, so even this kind of thing is very, very much concerned. We are not guaranteed that we may have this kind of M&A allowed in the United States. So what I'm saying is this: setting up or establishing tech supply resilience kind of system, we have to build up more trust between countries and also between firms in the US and Korea, so that we can enhance the trust by doing this kind of joint activities. Then companies and government may feel much more comfortable in the future, because even though like Japan and the United States, they have much more comfortable situation than Korea and United States. So this is a thing I think we hope to develop to be more kind of comfortable level in the future. Yeah.
Certainly an important element. Thank you. And moving to the final question for the panel. When Dr. Morris Chang toured the United States, looking at some of the TSMC plans to expand capacity, new plant development, and so forth, he commented on the scarcity of engineering supply, basically the number of US engineers who could help in terms of building out some of these factories. So the question to the panel, what can the US government do to address this? We have greater investment flowing in from Taiwan and South Korea, but Dr. Chang points to this point of essentially the scarcity of qualified engineers to essentially work on these type of projects. So if I could start with Damien on that one, please.
Obviously, the obvious answer would be try to have more STEM graduates in the United States. But if the domestic supply is not sufficient, then we got to be able to import talent, which means reforming our immigration policy in a more significant way, so that we do attract more STEM talent that not only come but also stay, and also let's try not to make them leave the United States once they've gotten their PhDs, or once they start working in companies. Because again, if we can't produce enough domestic STEM graduates, then we gotta basically make sure that the foreign talent, that we remain a magnet for foreign talent, and that's really one of the greatest advantages for the United States, and it has always been.
Thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, I completely agree. The U.S. ability to attract and retain talent, it needs to remain a strong suit. And I would say over the past few years, it's been a difficult environment for immigration policy and for visa policy. And that's something that we really need to protect. There shouldn't be any fear of attracting talent, regardless of where that talent resides, and trying to retain it, because ultimately that is how our country was founded, and that's how we'll continue to be prosperous and innovative.
And turning to you, Dr. Park.
Well, I totally agree with Damian and Naomi, but I agree with that. U.S. should have a more flexible immigration policy, but that means that, you know, Korea also need engineers ourselves for our own semiconductor industries or battery industries. However, these days, our students studying abroad, particularly in the United States, after they finish their degrees, they don't come back to Korea because the US is, you know, they need more experts. So they're hiring more and more people. So that means it's good for United States, but, you know, Korea and other countries will have, you know, difficult time in also supplying the appropriate expertise for engineers domestically. This is also our concern.
So it sounds like you're proposing a really good visa reciprocity and student exchange program for both countries.
A lot of good opportunities on the horizon here. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your sharing of your expertise on this very complex topic and something that we are going to be returning to from time to time. Thank you again, and really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you. Now I'd like to move to the wrap-up session for today. Today's panel, we heard our speakers provide great insights in terms of how the US and South Korea can work towards building this resilient technology supply chain for mutual prosperity and mutual security. We heard the wealth of opportunities and challenges and basically trying to navigate through all of them. During the third and final day of our summit tomorrow, we'll be placing the spotlight on urgent cybersecurity issues. Our day 3 keynote speaker will be Jean Lee, host of the BBC World Service podcast, The Lazarus Heist. She was previously the Pyongyang bureau chief with the Associated Press. Panel 3 will focus specifically on addressing North Korea's cyber criminal statecraft activities. Alex O'Neill, the co-founder and co-lead of the North Korea Cyber Working Group here at the Belfer Center, will be moderating this panel. The featured speakers include Jason Bartlett, the research associate with the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, and Ashley Chafet-Lamonov, who is the DPRK cyber crimes expert at Chainalysis. We also have Sahar Nauman, who is a principal threat intelligence analyst at BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, as well as David Park, senior policy advisor at the US Department of the Treasury. We'll have closing remarks by Consul General Ki-jun Yu of the Korean Consulate General here in Boston. Thank you all for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Good evening and good morning. Thank you.